The Whispered Truths of Willow Creek. It started on a Thursday morning, one of those slow, sun-drenched beginnings in Willow Creek, where the only thing louder than the birdsong was the buzz of gossip at Marcy's diner. On the surface, nothing seemed out of place. Sheriff Daniels was nursing his black coffee by the window, Miss Patty was unloading fresh peaches at the farmer's market, and over at the hardware store, Hank Carter was arguing about a shipment delay with his supplier. But then came the scream. It cut through the sleepy air like a blade, freezing the regulars mid-sentence. A moment later, Rebecca Carter, Hank's wife of 15 years, burst into the diner, her face pale as ash. Clutched in her trembling hands was an envelope. Plain, unassuming, but its contents, whatever they were, had clearly shattered her world. "He's lying to me," Rebecca choked out, her voice trembling. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for answers or allies. "All these years, and I didn't see it. But now I know." No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. Willow Creek wasn't the kind of town where secrets stayed buried for long. But this, whatever this was, felt bigger than the usual scandals that kept the rumor mill turning. Rebecca's gaze landed on Sheriff Daniels. "You knew," she whispered, her voice laced with venom. "Didn't you?" The sheriff's hand paused mid-lift, his coffee mug hovering just below his lips. "Rebecca, maybe we should talk." But she wasn't listening. Instead, she dropped the envelope onto the counter with a dull slap and stormed out, the doorbell jangling violently behind her. As the diner patrons watched her retreating figure, Marcy, the diner's owner, reached for the envelope. Her curiosity, like everyone else's, was too strong to resist. The room fell silent as she slid the contents into view. Photographs. Crisp, undeniable evidence of betrayal, except the face in the photos wasn't Hank's. It was Sheriff Daniels. The room erupted into chaos, but no one noticed Hank Carter standing in the shadows just outside the diner's window. He was holding a crumpled letter of his own, his expression unreadable as he turned and walked toward the edge of town, toward the old quarry. Something far darker than betrayal was about to surface in Willow Creek, and for those who thought they knew their neighbors, the truth was about to become far stranger and far deadlier than fiction. The town held its breath. Sheriff Daniels sat frozen, his fingers clenched tightly around his coffee cup, knuckles turning white. Marcy, the diner's owner, looked between him and the damning photographs spread across the counter. The images, grainy, black and white, showed Daniels with someone who wasn't his wife, in places that left little to the imagination. I can explain," Daniels finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, but the weight of the diner's eyes bore down on him like a judge's gavel. Rebecca Carter was already halfway down Main Street, her heels clicking angrily against the pavement. She didn't need to hear his excuses. She knew the truth now, and that was enough. What she didn't know, what no one in Willow Creek knew, was how far this betrayal reached. Across town, Hank Carter stood at the edge of the old quarry, staring down into the murky water below. His hands trembled as he unfolded the crumpled letter he'd found tucked beneath the windshield wiper of his truck that morning. "Hank, you don't know me, but I know you. I know what she did, what they did. Meet me where it all started. Tonight, 10 p.m., alone. If you want the truth." No signature, no explanation, just those chilling words. The quarry had always been a place of secrets. Teenagers dared each other to jump from its jagged cliffs. Old-timers told stories of lost souls who never surfaced. And now it was calling him too. Back at the diner, Sheriff Daniels shoved away from the counter, his jaw clenched. "This is a setup," he barked, but his voice wavered. The photos were too real, too precise. And yet, something gnawed at him. Why now? Why Rebecca? Marcy's eyes narrowed. "Maybe you should be asking yourself who's setting you up, Sheriff." Daniels didn't answer. He knew exactly who might want him gone. But if they were sending photos, it meant they weren't done playing yet. He had to act fast before Rebecca did something reckless, before Hank found out the rest of it. By nightfall, Willow Creek would no longer be the quiet little town it once was. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting Willow Creek in deep shades of orange and purple. Streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement. The town felt different tonight. Tense, like it was holding on to something it wasn't ready to share. Hank Carter stood at the edge of the quarry, his breath misting in the cool evening air. The letter in his pocket felt heavier with every passing second. He glanced at his watch. 9:58 p.m. 2 minutes. His heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in a long time he felt afraid. Footsteps crunched behind him. He turned sharply, his fists clenching instinctively. A shadow emerged from the trees, lean, cautious, and wearing a hood pulled low over their face. Hank squinted in the dim light. "You came," the stranger said, voice low and steady. "Yeah," Hank growled. "You got something to say it." The stranger took a step closer, reaching into their jacket. Hank tensed, ready to fight, but instead of a weapon, the figure pulled out another envelope. It was identical to the one Rebecca had shown at the diner earlier that day. "You don't know the half of it," the stranger muttered, handing it over. "Rebecca. She isn't who you think she is." Hank's throat tightened. He ripped the envelope open with shaking hands and pulled out the contents. More photographs. Not of Daniels this time, but of Rebecca. In places Hank didn't recognize, with people he didn't know. Money exchanged hands. Secret meetings in motels. A man Hank had never seen before, young, clean-cut, dangerous-looking. "What the hell is this?" Hank's voice cracked. "The truth," the stranger replied. "Sheriff Daniels isn't the only one with secrets. Your wife's been working with someone. Someone bad. You think this is about cheating?" The stranger scoffed. "It's bigger than that." Hank's stomach twisted. He could barely wrap his head around it. "Who are you?" he demanded. The stranger hesitated for a moment before stepping into the light, finally pulling down their hood. It was Emily Caldwell, the mayor's daughter. Hank staggered back. "Emily? What are you doing in the middle of all this?" Emily's eyes were sharp, filled with something Hank had never seen before, fear. "I don't have time to explain everything," she said, glancing over her shoulder nervously. "But your wife. She's in deep with something that could burn this whole town to the ground." Hank's mind reeled. Rebecca, his Rebecca, wrapped up in something bigger than a simple affair? He felt his grip tighten around the photos. "Why are you telling me this?" Emily hesitated. "Because I don't want to end up like the others," she whispered. A sudden rustling in the trees made them both freeze. "Run," Emily hissed. Before Hank could react, headlights flared through the darkness, and the roar of an engine shattered the night. Someone was coming, and they weren't coming to talk. Hank didn't hesitate. He grabbed Emily by the wrist and sprinted away from the oncoming headlights, his boots crunching against gravel as they slipped into the dense forest lining the quarry's edge. The roar of the engine grew louder, tires skidding against the dirt road. Whoever was behind that wheel wasn't planning on letting them get away. "Keep running," Emily panted, her voice ragged with fear. Hank's mind was racing just as fast as his legs. What the hell had Rebecca gotten herself into? And what did Emily mean by the others? They tore through the underbrush, ducking low-hanging branches and leaping over fallen logs, their breathing ragged in the heavy night air. The car screeched to a halt somewhere behind them, and Hank heard the sound of doors slamming. More than one. "We gotta get to my truck," he whispered, pulling Emily behind a tree. He peered through the darkness, his pulse hammering in his ears. "It's back at the gas station, if we can make it there." Emily shook her head violently. "No, they'll be waiting for you. They're watching everyone. Trust me, Hank, we have to go somewhere else." Hank frowned. "Who are they, Emily?" Before she could answer, the sharp snap of a twig behind them sent a chill up his spine. Someone was close. Too close. Hank tightened his grip on Emily's arm and gestured for her to stay quiet. They crouched low, pressing themselves against the rough bark, hoping whoever was out there would pass. A deep voice called out through the darkness. "Come on, Hank. We just want to talk." Hank swallowed hard. That voice, it belonged to Johnny Rourke, the town's so-called mechanic. But Hank knew better. Rourke wasn't just fixing cars, he was fixing problems, too. And right now, it seemed like Hank had become one. Emily looked at Hank, eyes wide with panic. "We can't let them find us," she mouthed. Hank nodded. His mind raced through their options, and in an instant he made a choice. Whispering low, he said, "Follow me, and don't stop, no matter what." They bolted. A shout echoed behind them, followed by heavy footsteps crashing through the trees. Hank felt his legs burning, his lungs screaming for air, but he pushed forward, gripping Emily's hand tightly. They burst through the trees onto the old railroad tracks, moonlight spilling over the rusted rails. Then bang! The crack of a gunshot split the night, and Hank felt a rush of heat near his shoulder as a bullet whizzed past. Emily shrieked, stumbling, but Hank yanked her up. "There!" Emily gasped, pointing toward an old, abandoned train station up ahead. Inside, with no other options, they sprinted toward the dilapidated building. They burst through the rotting doors and collapsed behind a stack of rusted crates, gasping for breath. Outside, the footsteps slowed. "They're close," Emily whispered, her face pale with fear. "What do we do now?" Hank wiped the sweat from his brow and reached into his pocket, feeling the crumpled photographs. Whatever this was, it was bigger than Rebecca, bigger than Daniel's. And if Johnny Rourke was involved, then it was bigger than he could have ever imagined. "We find out the truth," Hank said, his jaw set. "And we make damn sure they don't bury it with us." The old train station smelled of rust and decay, its forgotten walls echoing with the distant sound of crickets outside. Hank and Emily pressed themselves against the cool brick, trying to steady their breathing. The footsteps outside grew quieter, but they weren't gone. "Not yet. They're waiting us out," Hank muttered, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. Emily nodded, her eyes scanning the station's interior for another way out. "They're not going to leave until they find us," she whispered. "Rourke doesn't like loose ends." Hank's jaw clenched. He knew Johnny Rourke well enough to believe that. The man didn't talk much, but when he did, it usually ended with someone missing. Or worse. A creak echoed from the far end of the station. Emily stiffened. Hank grabbed a rusted metal pipe from the ground, his knuckles white around it. They listened, breath held tight, until they heard a familiar voice. "I know you're in there, Hank." It was Rourke. His voice was calm, almost patient. "Ain't no use hiding, bud. We just need to have a little chat." Hank exhaled slowly, his grip tightening. He leaned in close to Emily and whispered, "We're not getting out the front. We need another way." Emily nodded and pointed toward the far side of the station, where a broken window hung crooked in its frame. "There," she mouthed. Hank crept forward, careful to avoid the glass shards crunching under his boots. Emily followed close behind, her movements light and precise. She'd been in situations like this before, he could tell, and that scared him more than Rourke did. Just as they reached the window, a flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, sweeping dangerously close to their hiding spot. Hank froze, shielding Emily instinctively. "Come on, Carter," Rourke drawled. "You know what happens when people try to run from me. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Hank felt the anger boiling beneath his skin. He was sick of running, sick of secrets. He needed answers, and fast. With a deep breath, he whispered to Emily, "Go first. I'll cover you." Emily didn't argue. She slipped through the window with a surprising ease, landing silently outside. Hank took one last look at the station before climbing through himself, wincing as his boots crunched against broken glass. They sprinted through the tall grass, their silhouettes low against the moonlight. Behind them, Rourke's flashlight swept wildly across the field. "Find them," he barked to his men. Hank and Emily ducked into a drainage ditch, pressing themselves against the cool, damp earth. The voices grew louder as Rourke's men fanned out, boots thudding against the ground just inches away from their hiding spot. "Think they know about her?" one of the men muttered. Hank felt Emily stiffen beside him. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. He leaned in, whispering, "Who's her?" Emily's lips parted, hesitation flickering in her eyes. "Rebecca wasn't the first," she whispered. And if we don't get to the bottom of this, she won't be the last. Hank's stomach churned. What the hell did my wife get herself into, Emily? Before she could answer, the sound of a phone buzzing startled them both. Hank fumbled in his pocket, pulling it out. Unknown number. He hesitated for a split second, then answered. A distorted voice crackled through the speaker. You shouldn't have gone looking, Hank. Now you've got two choices. Dig deeper and drown, or walk away and pretend you never saw a damn thing. The line went dead. Hank stared at the phone, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Emily looked at him. What now? Hank's jaw tightened. We dig. Hank shoved the phone back into his pocket, his mind racing. The distorted voice wasn't a threat. It was a warning. But from who? And why now? Emily tugged on his sleeve, her eyes darting nervously through the tall grass. We need to move, she whispered. They won't stop looking. Hank nodded, scanning their surroundings. The drainage ditch led toward an old service road that wound its way behind the lumber yard. It wasn't much, but it was their best shot at slipping away unnoticed. Staying low, they crept through the underbrush, each rustling leaf and snapping twig feeling like a siren in the silent night. Hank's thoughts drifted to Rebecca. If she was tangled up in something bad, really bad, he needed to get to her before Rourke's men did. But first, he had to figure out who was pulling the strings in this town. As they neared the road, Emily grabbed his arm, stopping him. Hank, she whispered, her face pale under the moonlight. I have to tell you something. His pulse quickened. What is it? She swallowed hard, glancing over her shoulder before whispering. Rebecca didn't just stumble into this mess. She started it. Hank stared at her, his stomach sinking. What are you talking about? Emily looked away. Months ago, she came to me. She said she found something big. A ledger, buried in the town hall records. I didn't believe her at first, but then she showed me. Money going missing, names that didn't add up. She thought she could use it to. A sudden burst of headlights washed over them, cutting off her words. Hank shoved Emily down as a black SUV barreled onto the service road, its tires kicking up dust. The vehicle screeched to a stop just yards away. Two men stepped out, their silhouettes sharp against the blinding lights. Emily Caldwell. One of them called out, his voice deep and laced with amusement. Why don't you come out and we'll talk about this like grown-ups? Emily's grip tightened on Hank's arm. They know, she breathed. They know I helped her. Hank's mind spun. If Rebecca had uncovered something at town hall, something involving money and powerful names, then this wasn't just an affair. It was corruption, and it was bigger than he'd imagined. The man outside took a slow step forward, the sound of gravel crunching under his boots. You're making this harder than it needs to be, sweetheart, he called. Boss says bring you in alive if possible. Don't make me change that. Hank's muscles tensed. They were trapped. Emily looked at him, desperation in her eyes. We have to split up, she whispered. It's the only way. No way, Hank hissed. I'm not leaving you. She shook her head fiercely. I can lead them off. You need to get to Rebecca before they do. She's staying at the motel on Route 9. Room 14. She grabbed his hand, squeezing it tight. Go, Hank. Now. Before he could stop her, Emily bolted, darting through the trees in the opposite direction. The men shouted and gave chase, their flashlights bobbing wildly in the darkness. Hank hesitated for a heartbeat, then turned and ran toward Route 9. The Willow Creek motel stood on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering weakly against the black sky. Hank pulled his truck into the lot, parking far from the entrance. He sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady his nerves. Room 14. What the hell was Rebecca doing here? He crept up the stairs, his boots silent against the concrete. As he reached the door, he hesitated, listening. The faint hum of a television. A muffled voice inside. He raised his hand and knocked lightly. The door creaked open an inch, and Rebecca's wide, terrified eyes met his. She yanked him inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. Hank, she whispered, her voice shaking. You shouldn't have come. Hank took in the room. Suitcases half-packed, papers scattered across the bed. The tension in the air was thick. "Rebecca, what the hell is going on?" he demanded. She took a shaky breath, looking down at the papers. "I found something, Hank. Something I wasn't supposed to." She held up a sheet of paper, bank statements, property records, all linked to one name. Mayor Caldwell. Hank's blood ran cold. Rebecca's voice trembled. "He's been laundering money through the town for years, Hank. Rourke and his guys are his enforcers. And now that I know, they're not gonna let me leave." Hank ran a hand through his hair. "Why the hell didn't you tell me?" Rebecca's eyes welled with tears. "Because I knew you'd try to protect me, and I couldn't risk you getting hurt." Before Hank could respond, a noise outside made them both freeze. Footsteps. Slow. Purposeful. Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Hank moved to the window, peering out cautiously. A figure in a dark suit stood by his truck, inspecting it. And then, as if sensing Hank's eyes on him, the figure turned. It was Mayor Caldwell himself. And he was smiling. Hank's breath caught in his throat. Mayor Caldwell's smile wasn't friendly. It was knowing, calculated. He stood there in the flickering motel parking lot light, his hands in the pockets of his perfectly tailored suit, exuding a confidence that sent a cold chill down Hank's spine. Rebecca gripped his arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "He knows we're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Hank's mind raced. They were trapped, but running wasn't an option anymore. Caldwell was here, and that meant something was about to happen, something big. A sharp knock on the motel door made them both jump. "Open up!" A calm voice called from the other side. It wasn't Caldwell's. It was smoother, more dangerous. "Johnny Rourke. No point in dragging this out, Hank." Rebecca's eyes were wide with panic. Hank scanned the room quickly, looking for a way out. The bathroom window too small. The back door probably watched. The only way was through. He took a deep breath and motioned for Rebecca to stay quiet. Moving swiftly, he grabbed the heavy bedside lamp and positioned himself by the door. Another knock, more forceful this time. "Hank." Rourke's voice was softer now, almost amused. "You know how this goes. Open the door, we talk. Otherwise, I break it down, and trust me, you don't want that." Hank glanced at Rebecca, their eyes locking for a split second. He mouthed, "Stay down," then reached for the door handle. He turned it slowly, then yanked it open. Rourke barely had time to react before the heavy lamp crashed into his face with a sickening crunch. He staggered backward, blood streaming from his nose. Hank didn't wait. He grabbed Rebecca's hand and bolted down the hall. "Get them!" Caldwell's voice rang out behind them, cold and commanding. Hank and Rebecca tore down the narrow motel corridor, their feet pounding against the worn carpet. The exit sign at the far end glowed like a beacon, but as they reached it, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Deputy Mark Talbot. Gun drawn. "Don't move," Talbot ordered, his voice steady, but Hank saw the hesitation in his eyes. Rebecca froze, squeezing Hank's hand tightly. "Mark, please," she whispered. "You don't have to do this." Talbot shifted uncomfortably, his grip tightening on the gun. "I don't have a choice," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder. Footsteps pounded behind them. Rourke was recovering fast. Hank made a split-second decision. "Sorry, Mark," he said, then lunged forward. He grabbed the deputy's wrist, twisting it sharply. The gun clattered to the floor, and Hank shoved him aside, sending Talbot crashing into the wall. Rebecca snatched up the gun, and together they burst through the exit into the night. They sprinted across the parking lot, Hank's truck in sight. But Caldwell was waiting. He leaned casually against the driver's side door, arms crossed, watching them with that same unnerving smile. Rebecca raised the gun, her hands trembling. "Stay back," she shouted. Caldwell chuckled softly. Now, Mrs. Carter. Let's not do anything we'll regret." Hank stepped in front of her protectively. "What do you want, Caldwell?" The mayor's smile widened. "You already know what I want, Hank." His eyes flicked to the crumpled papers still clenched in Rebecca's hand. "I want what belongs to me." Rebecca's grip on the gun tightened. "Not a chance," she spat. Caldwell sighed, feigning disappointment. "I was hoping you'd see reason. You always were a stubborn woman, Rebecca." He nodded to someone behind them. "Take them." Before Hank could react, something cold and hard struck the back of his head. His vision swam, and the ground rushed up to meet him. Darkness swallowed him whole. When Hank came to, his head throbbed with a dull, relentless ache. He was tied to a chair in a dimly lit room that smelled of gasoline and damp wood. The muffled sound of water dripping echoed somewhere nearby. Rebecca was slumped against the wall, her hands bound, eyes fluttering open. Caldwell stood in front of them, casually adjusting his cufflinks. "You two have been quite the thorn in my side," he said, pacing slowly. "It's unfortunate, really. You could have just walked away." Hank's jaw clenched. "Not my style." Caldwell chuckled. "No, I suppose not. But here's the problem, Hank." He leaned in close, his voice a whisper now. "You've seen too much. And that ledger you two are so keen on keeping." He tapped his temple. "It contains more than just dirty money. Contains names. Big names. Names that don't like loose ends." Rebecca's voice was hoarse but defiant. "People will know if something happens to us." Caldwell smirked. "People might suspect. But knowing? That's another story." Hank struggled against the ropes, feeling the sharp burn against his wrists. He needed a way out, and he needed it fast. His eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could turn the tide. Caldwell straightened up, walking toward the door. "I'll leave you two to think about your options," he said, flashing that same unsettling smile. "But I wouldn't take too long." With that, the door clicked shut, and the sound of a lock sliding into place sealed their fate. Rebecca turned to Hank, fear and resolve warring in her expression. "What do we do now?" Hank exhaled sharply, his mind racing. "We do what we do best," he said, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "We fight." Hank flexed his wrists against the rope, feeling the fibers bite into his skin. Every muscle in his body screamed for action, but his mind stayed sharp. They had to get out of here, and fast. Rebecca watched him, her breathing ragged but determined. "Hank, they're going to kill us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the steady drip of water from somewhere in the room. Hank nodded slowly, scanning the dimly lit space. It was an old storage shed, judging by the rusting tools and the faint scent of motor oil hanging in the air. His gaze locked onto a rusty nail jutting out from the wooden beam behind him. He turned his chair slightly, inching toward it. "Keep talking," he whispered. "Make it sound like we're scared." Rebecca swallowed hard but nodded. "I never should have looked, Hank," she said, her voice breaking perfectly. "I thought I could outsmart them. But I was wrong. I just wanted to get us out of this town." Hank kept working the rope against the nail, feeling it fray. "You always were too damn smart for your own good," he said, playing along. "But you should have told me." Rebecca's eyes welled with tears. Whether from fear or exhaustion, he couldn't tell. "I didn't want to drag you into it. I thought I could handle it alone. But Caldwell, he has people everywhere." Hank grunted as the rope loosened slightly. Just a little more. The sound of footsteps outside made Rebecca stiffen. Hank's pulse quickened. "We don't have time," she whispered urgently. Hank gritted his teeth and gave the rope one last rub against the nail. It snapped. He shook his hands free, grabbing Rebecca's wrists and working on the knot. "Hold tight," he whispered, his fingers fumbling through the coarse rope. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A heavy pause. Then click. The lock turned, and the door creaked open, revealing Johnny Rourke's bruised and bloodied face. He grinned, holding a gun lazily at his side. "Time's up, Carter." Hank's fingers worked faster, finally slipping the rope free from Rebecca's hands. In one swift motion, he lunged forward, grabbing a nearby wrench from the workbench and swinging it hard. The wrench connected with a sickening thud, and Rourke stumbled backward, groaning as he crumpled to the ground. Hank grabbed Rebecca's hand. "Move!" They bolted through the open door and into the night, lungs burning with every step. The shed was located at the edge of an abandoned lumber mill, and the air was thick with sawdust and damp rot. They ran, their feet crunching against gravel, heartbeats thundering in their ears. Gunshots rang out behind them. Hank pushed Rebecca forward, diving behind a stack of wooden pallets. "Stay down!" he hissed, peeking over the edge. In the darkness, figures moved, 3, maybe 4 men, spreading out in search of them. Rebecca clutched Hank's arm. "We have to get to the highway," she whispered. "There's a shortcut through the mill." Hank nodded. "Let's go." They moved low and fast, slipping through the skeletal remains of the old mill. Rusted chains dangled from the ceiling, swaying gently in the wind. The place was a maze of shadows, perfect for hiding, but also for getting trapped. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the mill, freezing them in place. "You think you can run from me, Carter?" Caldwell. Hank tightened his grip on Rebecca's hand and whispered, "We're not running anymore." They pressed forward, weaving through the debris until they reached an old service ladder leading to the roof. Hank motioned for Rebecca to climb. Once they reached the top, they could see the distant lights of the highway, a glimmer of salvation in the darkness. But just as Rebecca reached the top, a hand clamped around Hank's shoulder, yanking him back. "Caldwell." Hank barely had time to react before the mayor's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling against the metal railing. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Caldwell growled, wiping sweat from his brow. "You had a good life here, Carter. Why'd you have to go digging?" Hank staggered to his feet, wiping blood from his lip. "Because someone had to." Caldwell chuckled darkly. "Well, you won't be digging much longer." He pulled a gun from his coat, aiming it squarely at Hank's chest. A loud crack echoed through the night. Caldwell's face twisted in shock as he staggered back, a crimson bloom spreading across his shirt. Behind him, Rebecca stood with the gun she'd taken from Talbot, her hands trembling but her aim steady. Hank rushed to her, grabbing the gun. "Come on, we're getting out of here." Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had called the cops. Hank helped Rebecca down from the roof, and they sprinted toward the highway, breathless and desperate. The truth was out now, but so were they. And in a town like Willow Creek, the truth could get you killed. The cold wind howled around them as Hank and Rebecca stumbled onto the empty highway, their lungs burning from the sprint. The distant wail of sirens sent a shiver down Hank's spine. Whether the cops were coming to help or to silence them was anyone's guess. Rebecca's face was pale, but she clutched the gun tightly. "What now?" she panted, scanning the road for any sign of headlights. Hank wiped the sweat and blood from his brow. His mind was spinning. Caldwell was down, but that didn't mean they were safe. If he was right, and he usually was, this corruption ran deeper than just the mayor. Rourke was still out there. And worse, whoever was pulling the strings from the shadows wouldn't stop until Rebecca and Hank were nothing more than a memory. "We can't stay here," Hank said, his voice hoarse. "If the cops show up, we don't know whose side they're on. We need to disappear." Rebecca swallowed hard. "Disappear where?" Hank's eyes narrowed as he looked toward the dark horizon. "I know a place, but first we need a ride." They jogged down the highway, staying low in the ditches along the side of the road. Hank's mind raced through their dwindling options. They needed to figure out exactly how much Rebecca had uncovered, and more importantly, how to use it without ending up in a ditch themselves. Minutes later, a set of headlights appeared in the distance, growing closer. Hank stepped onto the road, waving his arms. The car slowed, hesitated, then stopped. The driver, an old man in a trucker cap, rolled down the window cautiously. "Y'all okay?" the man asked, his eyes flicking between them and the gun in Rebecca's hand. Hank forced a strained smile. "Flat tire a few miles back. Think you can give us a lift?" The man looked them over, suspicion in his eyes, but eventually nodded. "Hop in." Half an hour later, the truck pulled into a remote gas station on the outskirts of town. Hank and Rebecca climbed out, thanking the driver before he sped off. leaving them under the flickering fluorescent lights. Rebecca exhaled, rubbing her arms. Hank, where are we going? Hank glanced around before leading her behind the station to a row of abandoned trailers. There's someone we need to see, he said, pushing open the door of the last one. Inside, an old CB radio crackled softly, the scent of stale cigarettes filling the air. Sitting at a cluttered desk was a man Hank hadn't seen in years, Bobby Lang, a former reporter turned conspiracy theorist who knew more about Willow Creek's dirty laundry than anyone. Bobby looked up from his computer, raising an eyebrow. Well, he said, leaning back in his chair. If it isn't Hank Carter. Thought you got yourself out of this town. Did, Hank replied. Didn't stick. Bobby's eyes flicked to Rebecca. And the lovely Mrs. Carter. You know, I always thought you two were trouble. Rebecca crossed her arms. We need help, Bobby. He smirked. That's what they all say. What kind of help? Hank dropped the papers Rebecca had stolen onto the table. We have proof. Money laundering, property fraud, payoffs. Caldwell's been running this town like his personal piggy bank. Bobby whistled low, flipping through the pages. Damn, this is deep. No wonder they're after you. Can you get this out? Rebecca asked, her voice hopeful. Make people listen? Bobby scratched his chin, thinking. Maybe, but it's not that simple. He looked Hank dead in the eye. Whoever's at the top of this, they're bigger than just Caldwell. You take one down, someone else steps in. You need more than paper, you need proof they can't bury. Hank sighed. What do you suggest? Bobby leaned forward, lowering his voice. There's a safe house outside town. A place where Caldwell and his people meet when they don't want eyes on them. If you want real proof, you'll find it there. Rebecca looked at Hank nervously. It's dangerous. Hank nodded. Yeah, but it's our only shot. Bobby scribbled an address on a scrap of paper. You didn't get this from me, he muttered. Hank stuffed it into his pocket and stood. We owe you. Bobby smirked. Damn right you do. And Hank, he added as they turned to leave, watch your back. This town chews people up and spits them out. Later that night, Hank and Rebecca sat in the truck they'd stolen from the gas station, staring at the rundown building in the woods. The safe house. No lights, no movement, but Hank knew better. You ready? He asked Rebecca. She swallowed hard, nodding. Let's end this. Hank reached for the gun in his waistband and opened the door. Stay close. They moved through the underbrush toward the building, hearts pounding in unison. Inside, muffled voices carried through the thin walls. Hank pressed his ear to the door, listening. He's already dead. Carter's next. Then we tie up the rest of the loose ends. Hank's stomach twisted. They weren't just cleaning up. They were finishing the job. He signaled Rebecca, and with a deep breath, he kicked the door open. Time to end this. The door slammed open with a crash, sending a cloud of dust swirling through the dimly lit room. Hank stepped in first, gun raised, scanning the space. Rebecca followed close behind, her breath shallow but steady. Inside, a group of men sat around a worn wooden table, frozen in shock. Papers, whiskey glasses, and a small black duffel bag were scattered across the surface. At the head of the table sat Jameson Watts, the town's biggest real estate mogul, and the real power behind Mayor Caldwell. Well, Watts drawled, leaning back in his chair. Look what the cat dragged in. Hank didn't lower his gun. End of the line, Watts. We know everything. Watts smirked, unfazed. He glanced at the other men. Business owners, city officials, even Deputy Talbot, whose face paled at the sight of Hank. Knowing and proving are two very different things, Carter, Watts said smoothly, his fingers tapping the table. You don't have what it takes to bring me down. Rebecca stepped forward, holding up the stolen ledger. You sure about that? She snapped. Watts' smirk faltered for a split second before he masked it with a chuckle. That's cute. But you see, sweetheart, we run this town. You think you're the first to dig into our business. His gaze darkened. You won't be the last to disappear. Hank felt the air in the room tighten. He could see it in Watts' eyes. He wasn't bluffing. They had to act fast. Enough talk, Hank growled. Rebecca grabbed the bag. "We're leaving." One of What's men, big, mean-looking, moved to block them. Hank didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, landing a solid punch to the guy's gut, sending him staggering back. Before anyone else could react, Rebecca grabbed the duffel bag and sprinted for the door. Gunfire erupted. Hank ducked, pulling Rebecca down as bullets tore through the room, splintering wood and shattering glass. He returned fire, hitting the lights and plunging the place into chaos. "Go, go!" Hank shouted, dragging Rebecca toward the back exit. They burst into the night air, the cool wind slapping against their faces. Hank's truck was parked a few yards away. Behind them, shouting voices echoed through the trees. Rebecca fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking. "Come on! Come on!" The truck roared to life, tires spinning against the gravel. Hank slammed the door shut as bullets ricocheted off the back bumper. "Hold on!" he yelled, flooring the gas pedal. The truck fishtailed onto the main road, headlights cutting through the dark, leaving Watts and his men behind. But Hank knew it wasn't over. Not yet. They didn't stop until they reached Bobby Lang's trailer. Inside, Bobby was already waiting, the CB radio crackling behind him. His eyes widened at the sight of them, disheveled and breathless. "You get it?" Bobby asked. Rebecca threw the duffel bag onto the table, spilling its contents. Stacks of cash, documents, and most importantly, a flash drive. "We got it," she said, her voice steady. Bobby whistled low, plugging the drive into his laptop. Lines of incriminating data filled the screen: bribes, shell companies, even payouts to law enforcement. "Oh man, this is good," he muttered. "This is real good." Hank leaned against the counter, running a hand through his hair. "How fast can you get it out?" Bobby grinned. "Fast enough." Rebecca took a deep breath, looking at Hank. "Once this goes public, we'll never be safe here again." Hank reached for her hand, squeezing it. "We were never safe here to begin with." Bobby clicked a few keys, uploading the files to every major news outlet he could reach. "And sent," he said triumphantly. "In a few hours, every journalist from here to New York is going to be sniffing around Willow Creek." Hank nodded. "Then we better not be here when they do." By dawn, the town was in chaos. News vans lined Main Street, reporters shoving microphones in people's faces. The sheriff's office was swarmed, and Mayor Caldwell had vanished. Watts' properties were being raided by federal agents, and his men, they were nowhere to be found. Hank and Rebecca stood at the edge of town, their bags packed in the back of the truck. Rebecca looked out at the place they once called home. "Do you think it'll ever change?" she asked quietly. Hank watched the sun rise over the hills, a bittersweet smile crossing his face. "Maybe, maybe not. But at least it won't be our problem anymore." She nodded, climbing into the truck. As they drove away, leaving the secrets of Willow Creek behind, Hank felt the weight lifting off his chest. But deep down, he knew that some ghosts never stayed buried. And in a town like Willow Creek, the truth was only ever a heartbeat away from another lie. The end.